Welcome everybody to this afternoon's event on behalf of the Centre for Innovative Justice. I want to welcome everyone in our audience, our expert panel, and of course our guest speaker, Minister Natalie Hutchins, who I'll introduce a little bit later. Before we go any further, however, I wish to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of RMIT University. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we all join this call today, and respectfully acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, including any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. I also acknowledge the devastating and ongoing impacts of colonisation, which have a direct and continuing relationship with the vastly disproportionate rate at which Aboriginal people have contact with the criminal justice system, as well as their experiences of racism and discrimination once this contact actually occurs. We certainly recognise the extraordinary strength and resilience of Aboriginal communities in the face of these impacts. Well, it's certainly fantastic to have everyone here today, and we've got a lot to get through. The paper we're launching has been a long time in the making. It actually had, as its inception, a scoping project conducted by two RMIT social work students, Alex Johnson and Crystal Lee, back in 2018. They sought the wisdom of some of the many frontline services and advocates who have been working with criminalised women for so long. And we thank these organisations for their insights and time, and we certainly want to thank both Alex and Crystal for the great work that they undertook. Next came a very extensive literature review to bring together this more substantial resource, the aim of which is to combine in one place information on the reasons why increasing numbers of women are being imprisoned in Victoria, how women's experience of the justice system differs to that of men, and the disproportionate harm caused by incarcerating women, and also foundations for reversing the damaging trend that Victoria is currently experiencing. We'll hear first from one of the authors of the paper, Catherine Caruana, about some of the headline findings from the paper, before moving to a discussion from a fantastic panel of advocates and experts who will be introduced in turn by our facilitator, Elena Campbell. Then I'll return to introduce the Minister to speak and formally launch the paper. I do note that because we only have an hour, we won't be able to field questions from our very sizable audience, but we'll touch on follow-up steps at the end of the hour. So, Catherine Caruana, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everyone. Given the broad scope of this topic, I'm only going to be able to briefly touch on some key findings and just flag our proposed approach to reform. We wanted to keep front and centre international standards on the treatment of women in prison, known as the Bangkok Rules. These set out the obligations of states to find alternatives to prison for women. In the 11 years since their introduction, however, and despite having a women's correctional policy in place, we've seen exponential growth in the number of women in Victorian prisons. Next slide. The most recent data from the World Prison Brief shows that Australia imprisons more women per 100,000 head of population than Canada, the UK and many European countries. In the 10 years to June 2018, there was close to a 138% increase in the number of women in Victorian prisons. This compares with an 81% increase in the male prison population. This increase occurred despite the fact that the proportion of women on remand for a violent crime has dropped and that crime rates in general are dropping. Next slide. There have been even more dramatic increases in the rate at which Aboriginal and we need to go back a slide. Yep. In which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are imprisoned. Between 2012 and 2018, the number of Aboriginal women entering prison more than tripled, making them the fastest growing group in Victoria's prison system. Aboriginal women are imprisoned at a rate that is disproportionate to both non-Indigenous women and Aboriginal men. The crucial issue of this widening justice gap for Aboriginal women will be discussed in more detail by the panel. Next slide. The growing proportion of women in prison who are held on remand is also telling and is significantly higher than that for men. Remand is the time spent in custody pending your charges being heard instead of being on bail. Prison reception data indicates that close to 90% of all women entering prison have no charges proven against them. Because they commonly face less serious charges than men, this means women are more likely to spend short, damaging periods in custody. Around 40% will spend more time on remand than they eventually get as a sentence. Next slide. The second significant finding is that women charged with offences are almost universally themselves victims of crime. Studies suggest a range of 77 to 90% of women having prior trauma exposure, predominantly from gendered crime, such as family violence and sexual assault, both as adults and in childhood. As a result, women present with high rates of mental and physical ill health, disability, and drug and alcohol dependence. 45% of women entering prison have a chronic health condition, compared to 28% of men. They are more likely than men to self-harm, attempt suicide, and overdose. Aboriginal women carry a particularly heavy mental health burden, with one study finding 92% of Aboriginal women in prison had a mental illness, and close to half met at least one criterion of PTSD. And links between trauma, substance dependence, and offending and reoffending are well recognised in the research. Next slide. The paper also explores factors within the criminal justice system that are driving up female incarceration rates, and in particular approaches to policing, bail and sentencing. Reforms to Victoria's bail laws over the last decade are disproportionately impacting women, with a drift towards tougher sentencing also resulting in shrinking sentencing options. This graph tracks the growing female imprisonment rate over a 12-year period against sentencing and bail reforms. The red line represents all women in prison and the blue line Aboriginal women. Police policies and culture also have a big impact on both women's experience of the system and the outcomes that follow. An example of this is where zero tolerance approaches to family violence result in victim survivors being characterised as aggressors. We'll hear more from the panel about how these changes, combined with a lack of appropriate services and support in the community, and particularly barriers to accessing housing, play out for women. Next slide. Women's experience of the justice system is also different to that of men. Even short periods in custody are long enough to severely disrupt women's lives. They risk losing care of their children, their housing, and getting further behind in debt, but not long enough for women to benefit from programs that address issues linked to their offending. We also heard from service providers of unplanned and unsupported release from prison, including women being released late at night with no accommodation, no ID, no phone, and not even a Myki card. With women more likely than men to be primary caregivers, children removed from their mothers face an increased risk of criminalisation themselves. Out-of-home care has been described by researchers as a pipeline to prison. So while tough on crime reforms are often justified in the name of public safety, there is a compelling argument that imprisoning women only acts to compromise public safety in the long term. Next slide. The issues paper provides a broad outline of changes needed to improve responses for women via a targeted women's justice strategy organised under these 5 principles. We don't have time to outline the specifics of the proposed strategy, but these are set out in section 3 of the paper. Some of these reforms have wider application and provide an opportunity to trial approaches with the potential to reduce prison numbers more broadly. And the final slide, Heidi. It's an expansive, complex topic to cover, so it's a substantial paper. but the fact sheet, which is also available on the CIJ website, provides a useful summary. In closing, thanks again to these organisations for their contributions to the project and to the work done by Alex and Crystal, who did such a great job in the early phase of the project. I'll hand over to you now, Elena, to kick off the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks for all the hard yards you did on the research for this paper. It's really sizable resource. So we've heard everyone from Catherine about some of the themes explored in the paper that the Minister will kindly launch for us later today. And as Catherine's also indicated, while a portion of the paper is focused on articulating the problem, the other half is on exploring the solutions. Now, we can't hope to cover all of the issues in the paper in today's short session, but we've got a fantastic panel here today, some of whom have contributed to the paper's development and all of whom can help us to draw out some of the priority themes and identify ways forward, both for Victoria and in terms of thinking about the challenges from a national perspective. So I'm going to take us through some of those considerations now, introducing each panel member briefly as we go. So, firstly to you, Antoinette Braybrook. You're the CEO of Change the Record as well as CEO of Djirra, and you've been an advocate for Aboriginal women and communities for decades. One of the most urgent issues facing Victoria is the rate at which Aboriginal women are being incarcerated. We've touched briefly on some of the systemic drivers for women's incarceration rates generally, but why do these impact so disproportionately on Aboriginal women? And what impact is this having on their families and communities as well?
Thanks, Elena. Can I just clarify that I'm not the CEO of Change the Record, I'm the co-chair of Change the Record. But can I just quickly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also just to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. So can I also acknowledge the experiences of all women? For Aboriginal women, the justice system and other systems disproportionately impact us by design. The systems as we see them today have been built on white privilege, and they target the most vulnerable and marginalised people in our communities. Djirra sees this in the work that we do with Aboriginal women. We see the poor and unsafe police responses when our women report violence, and we see how this breaks trust. And we see how our women and our people are either targeted or treated as criminals, or how we are overlooked when our safety is compromised. When our women do find the courage to report violence to the police, they are often misidentified as perpetrators of violence and criminalised. Our women are not believed and their lives are not valued. We see how our women, our mums, are not supported to escape violence and keep their children safe. This contributes to the high removal rates of our kids from families and communities. When our kids are removed and placed in out-of-home care, they then get caught up in the youth justice system and then move on to adult prisons. Child removal creates a clear pathway to adult prisons. And we heard that just a moment ago. We see how family violence is both a cause and consequence of our women landing in prison. And we see the way new laws like the harsher bail laws significantly impact on our people and especially our women. The systemic racism separates our families and devastates our communities. This leads to a loss of connection to culture and our identity. It perpetuates the cycle of disadvantage. We want to see our governments stop putting millions and millions of dollars into expanding existing prisons and building new ones, because it will be our people and our women that fill those beds, those cells. we want to see a greater investment into Aboriginal community controlled organisations, specialist organisations like Djirra, where our work is strength-based. We don't look at our people, our women, through a deficit lens, as the system does. An investment into Aboriginal community control is a no-brainer when you think about how many of our women sit on remand for long periods of time, and they are there for such minor offences, mostly for reasons related to poverty and homelessness, and often, as we've heard, do not get a custodial sentence. One day in prison will destroy her life, her children's lives, and it will continue to cause irretrievable damage to our families and our communities. Just quickly to finish up with some more statistics, and we heard before that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are the fastest growing prison population in the country, and at least 90% of our women in prison have experienced sexual or family violence, and 80% of our women in prison are mums. And like, let's do the maths on that. You know, how many kids are without their mums? In Victoria in 2019, 1 out of 500 Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander women were incarcerated. This is compared to 1 out of 5,000 other women in Victoria. And nationally, our women are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised for family violence.
Thanks so much, Antoinette, for highlighting all of those issues really powerfully and in such a coherent and way brought together, which summarises the issues for us really, really well. Ellie Pappas, you're the CEO of the Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, a specialist legal service supporting women in contact with the criminal justice system. Can you tell us a bit more specifically how systemic drivers are interacting to impact on your clients and making it harder for women to remain in the community?
Certainly. Thanks, Elena. And I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, emerging, and just reiterate again the importance of centring the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women discussions because of those disproportionate impacts that all acting on women, the justice system generally have, in particular on Aboriginal. So in terms of those systemic drivers, I think what really jumps out at the moment is very high proportion of women who demand. So that very useful graph and mapping exercise that's included in that report that tracks the number of women on demand as against various to bail laws and sentencing laws really highlights the significant impact of recent bail reform on those numbers of women in Victoria. The graph cut off before the current data was available, but we know now that the number on remand has continued to increase and is in fact the highest it's ever been. So currently in Victoria, 54% of the prison population, Dame Phyllis Frost, are on remand. So it's the highest it's ever been. There are more unsentenced women in prison than there are sentenced. And really, the bail laws that we introduced in 2018 have had a very clear and significant impact on those numbers. They were brought in the wake of serious violent offending committed by men, but they have disproportionately affected women. They've caught women who are charged with low-level offending up in this system where they're now required to demonstrate the same exceptional circumstances as someone who's been charged with murder, terrorism, trafficking of commercial quantities of drugs. So they're being caught up in this system that was intended to make the community safer. It was intended to capture violent, dangerous criminals, but in fact what we're doing is targeting women who are offending because of poverty, because of homelessness, because of disadvantage. So we see clients who are on bail for shop theft of food, of groceries, essential items, who then might commit another shop theft, and they're placed on remand and they're required to show exceptional circumstances, and it's very difficult for them to then be released into the. But what we're also seeing is that the rates for women on remand are outstripping men time and time again. So as well as the bail laws, what I think this tells us is that the support that we have in the community is not sufficiently tailored to experiences of women. So we don't have in place in the community services that are going to keep women safe. We really need to do more around tailoring a specific response to women to ensure that we can keep them out of custody.
Thanks so much, Ellie, and a beautiful segue into my question to Elisa. Buggy, the Executive Officer at Flat Out, is an organisation that has also advocated for criminalised women's needs for many decades. Can you tell us a bit more, Elisa, about how lack of access to the kind of supports that Ellie was mentioning, such as housing, is informing court and service responses to women?
Yeah, hi Elena, thanks very much. And also I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm privileged to be coming to you from today. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. And for all the reasons that both Antoinette and Ellie have spoken to so beautifully, and that we see every day in our work. Flat Out provides a set of outreach to women and trans and gender diverse folk who have been criminalised, and the vast majority of those people have been imprisoned as part of their journey. And I think in thinking about the seemingly intractable issues that happen for people who are facing criminalisation, particularly women facing criminalisation, always comes to mind one of our amazing outreach workers, Caitlin Coleman, who came back from court one day as part of her work in the Women Transforming Justice program, which was a partnership with Ellie and with at LACWA and Fitzroy Legal Service as well. And she said to me that the magistrate had said, but for the services and support that we were offering at the time to a woman who was facing a significant, potentially significant sentence, but was certainly facing remand prior, she wouldn't be walking out the front door, so to speak. And I think, and we saw that time and time again in that program, and we continue to see it. Certainly, what we know is that homelessness is one of the biggest precipitators of women going into custody. And then, so there is an enormous proportion of women going into prison in Victoria, either on remand or on sentence, who are homeless at that point. And then, sadly, there is an even bigger number of women coming out of prison who come into homelessness. And so, a major part of our work at Flat Out is to try to find somewhere for those women to not only have a house, but for somewhere for them to call a home. Of course, there would be somebody pressing the doorbell at just this time in my speech, but so excuse the background noise. One of the other things, though, of course, is that not only in our work in our outreach with trying to find housing and homelessness and alcohol and other drug support, mental health support, disability support, family violence support, the list goes on and on. But when you have the overlay of criminalisation, particularly imprisonment in your history, in your background, there is an extraordinary amount of service refusal that happens. So it's extremely difficult for those women then to get the door open, even to be able to have the conversation, to try and access those services. So we at Flat Out call our support workers, outreach support and advocacy workers, and the advocacy part in that work is really trying to engage mainstream services to accept and to provide the women that we support, that we work with every day, with the support that they deserve and that they need to stay out of that revolving door. Yeah, as I say, seemingly intractable, but certainly there are an extraordinary number of things that we could do to shift the focus and flip around the telescope, as it were, to make the larger end more focused on the supports rather than locking people up in the first place.
Thanks so much, Elisa. And again, gives us a great, beautiful segue into my question to Dorothy Armstrong, who is a really crucial member of the CIJ staff and has made powerful representations to about her experiences of many of the things that Elisa's just described, both to courts, governments, royal commissions, and also to the media. But one of the things we talked about, Dorothy, that would be really important, or we felt was really important to highlight, was what it means to be a victim of crime yourself, either from childhood or in adulthood, and then coming into contact with the criminal justice system, and what that does in terms of your sense of safety and sense of control that you have over your own life and your own body. Do you want to talk about that and how that carries into your life on a daily basis still?
Yeah, thank you, Elena, and thank you very much to the women who've spoken before me. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, as challenging as it is, to talk about my personal experiences. For me, I'm the youngest of 11 children, and I grew up in family violence and all sorts of stuff. And I know today that I have an acquired brain injury from family violence. And for me, my first contact with police was as a victim of crime. And as a result of that, I was actually then in turn assaulted by the police who was investigating that matter, and that completely devastated me. And that really that changed me as a human being. And I understand today that, you know, yeah, I had absolutely no trust in anybody, men, and certainly police at that point. And I was really quite terrified, even though I didn't really understand it at the time. Like, I was 17 years old, and I didn't really understand it then. I do now. And, you know, and other experiences was just that absolute terror and being victimised by men, and then to have men in power like police, well, you know, it changed me as a human being and affected every area of my life. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. And it's a huge thing. It's a huge step to be able to talk about that, because I know that you've been on a kind of journey in terms of the kinds of things that you want to highlight and talk about. But it's really important for us to understand what it is, what happens when a system takes control away from people who've never felt that they had control in the first place, what the impacts of that are, and what the likely implications and repercussions are for how they might respond to the system's intervention. Mindy Sotiri is Executive Officer of the Justice Reform Initiative, a national coalition advocating for a shift in our response to criminal justice systems. You've been overseeing some really important research, and this includes surveying a significant number of people around Australia about their awareness of criminal justice issues. Can you describe what people know about criminalised women's experiences, and what are some of the other issues which surprise them?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Elena. I also, and thank you, Dorothy, for that incredibly powerful talk just then. I'm just sort of collecting my thoughts, because I think that your experience is probably, you know, so much more likely to kind of engage people than my sort of, you know, overview of the market research. But I'll go through some of the findings that are relevant to this. Also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm working on, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This land was never ceded, and I want to also pay my respects to elders past and present, and my respects to all First Nations people in the webinar today. So yeah, we conducted a fairly significant piece of market research, close to 2,500 surveys of people across Australia. So using a sort of respondent panel with representation across all age groups and states and territories. And we did a lot of segmentation in terms of voting preferences and different kinds of sort of voting intentions. And we also did some qualitative groups. The reason we really wanted to do this research was to allow us at the Justice Reform Initiative and other advocates in the space to really start trying to understand the context of what a communications strategy might look like in terms of where people are already at with their thinking in terms of the justice system, to test sort of potential messages for a really broad group of people, including, of course, I guess really importantly, people who aren't usually engaged in these kinds of conversations about the justice system. And I guess the first thing to note is that when we were testing for context and the level of concern about a range of different social issues, the criminal justice system, or specifically the need to reduce the numbers of people in prison, was very much down the bottom of the list of things that people are concerned about. So COVID, climate change, hospitals, healthcare, unemployment. There's a long list of things that people are concerned about that are likely to sort of influence voting intention before it comes to thinking about prison. We also tested for sort of confidence and understanding, and found that the vast majority of people reported knowing very little about the justice system. So I guess that's quite important to sort of have in mind when we're trying to think about how do we tell these stories, how do we bring people along to reform the system when we know that the large numbers of people are not necessarily coming to these kinds of seminars or engaging in Twitter around these issues. So what we did was test a range of messages around different things about the justice system that I guess researchers identified as being very broken. And we also tested messages around a range of different cohorts. And a whole range of sort of things around just sort of some stats around the justice system. Really interestingly, I guess, is that the kinds of issues that a lot of us in this space tend to think about in terms of kind of a rights-based framework. So overrepresentation of First Nations population, overrepresentation of people with disabilities, people with mental illness. These messages, when we told people about those sort of figures and the stats, people weren't particularly concerned, or they weren't as concerned as what they were about some other things. What people were really concerned about sort of across the board and across a range of different voting preferences was really around the brokenness of the system itself. So people were very concerned about the cost. That was in fact the biggest concern when we sort of tested factual pieces of information. But really this concern about the cost operated alongside the information that we provided that prison wasn't working. They were surprised that prison wasn't working in the way that they might have expected it to. So the fact that recidivism is really high, the fact that people leave prison into homelessness, the fact that for so many people the experience of prison actually makes things worse rather than better concern people. And just finally, in terms of, I mean, there's a million things to say about all of this and we might get some more time, but in terms of cohorts, the messages that really resonated were, perhaps not surprisingly, and I think there's been some amazing work with people involved in the Raise the Age campaign, the fact that we imprison children as young as 10 was a matter of great concern, again, across a number of different demographics and voting intentions and so on. But actually the fact that the majority of women in prison were also victims of crime, often in the form of gendered violence, was the thing that created the greatest level of concern when we were testing messages that sort of had more of an impact, so less stats and facts based and more sort of descriptive around what the system does. We found that the scenario of the greatest concern, again across all of the demographics, was the incarceration of women for non-violent crime and the impact that this then had on their children. So the non-violent nature of many of the crimes, coupled with the fact that women themselves are also victim survivors of violence, and alongside the consequences of incarcerating women, the consequences of that on their children who are then perhaps going to become victims of the same kind of systemic failure, was actually the message that, again, across the board, people really connected to and felt incredibly concerned about. So I think that there's some really important information, I guess, for thinking broadly, publicly about how we talk about the system, and also, you know, for the minister and others thinking politically about the sort of appetite perhaps on the part of the public that we might underestimate in terms of concern for particular populations inside.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mindy. There's a huge amount there. But hopefully, Dorothy, you find that validating in terms of your own experience. But I just want to throw to Ellie and Elisa, because Mindy has flagged that survey respondents were surprised that the system doesn't function as they expected. As the heads of agencies that have worked together so collaboratively in the past, could you talk briefly about two things, some things which might make the biggest difference? Bearing in mind that we've got to keep really, really tightly to time.
I'm happy to kick off with that, and apologies if my my microphone's not working so well. So I think, look, at the root of all of this is getting services that are truly responsive to the needs of women in the criminal justice system. So not just gender responsive, but they have to be trauma informed. They have to be flexible. They have to address the underlying causes of a woman's interaction with that justice system without applying rigid criteria and without, applying judgment. So we want to set women not up to fail, but to succeed. And we're not trying to prove that the system is beyond them. We need to adapt that system so that it works and meets the woman where she is, and doesn't just look at one instance of non-attendance or one way that she's not fitting in with how services run and say, well, bad luck, it's not going to work for you, and the only option is jail. We need to be better with how we respond in terms of designing services in the community and ensuring that we're meeting women where they're at, and really listening to them in terms of how we can design things better. So I think holistic services, gender responsive services, culturally safe and competent services, and services that really understand the underlying trauma that often is in the histories and background of women who come into contact with the justice system.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ellie. And one of the things that I'd add to that and reiterate your point about meeting women where they're at and really hearing what they want rather than some preordained cookie cutter approach to how we support an individual person's needs. But I think to add to that as well, one of the things that I think that the general community might be surprised to learn is that when you have a criminalisation as part of your story, particularly imprisonment, health services are much more, and support services in particular, are much more difficult to access because of the service refusal I talked to before, but also because most of the burden of funding for those services then gets handed over to the minister's portfolio rather than to working in sitting under health and human services support, and so the lens again is shifted to one that is underpinned by correctional understandings of what support and rehabilitation and reducing recidivism look like, rather than meeting the person where they're at and their needs. And I think that if we were to shift that approach and again to twist that telescope around, we might see much more person-centred, holistic and also effective approaches to supporting women who really need it.
Thanks so much, Ellie and Elisa. Antoinette, what would make the biggest difference for Aboriginal women, either in early contact with the criminal justice system or leaving custody? Just need to unmute.
The biggest difference for Aboriginal women is to have an Aboriginal community controlled organisation that is culturally safe, and that's what Djirra is. We don't look at women as victims. We see women's resilience and we see women's courage, and we invest in Aboriginal women in every way. you know, whether Aboriginal women are employed with us or they're users of our service, and their voice and their visibility matters to us. We will not silence women, we will not judge women. And so Djirra's programs are all designed by and for Aboriginal women. And our services are holistic. That makes a real difference. We provide legal services, which is a really small part of the work that we do, but an important part. And the biggest thing that draws women to Djirra is our early intervention prevention programs in communities, which build that trust and confidence in not only our services but other services, and we deliver those within the prison as well. And to women on community corrections orders. And some of you may have heard of our Sisters Day Out program, our Dilly Bag programs, and our Young Love programs. And so they both work inside the prison and outside. Preferably, we'd like to be doing this all outside of the prison walls. But I guess, you know, because of us delivering legal services for our people, you know, historically the law has been used as a tool of oppression. So it's really difficult for our people to now see, and especially our women, to see that the law is something that can help. You know, like we know that early access to legal representation for mums who are experiencing family violence will prevent child removal. But our women don't necessarily know that or identify child protection as a legal issue. Our Djirra has expanded its services to include counselling and case management to ensure that we do provide that holistic approach. And we've also been able to expand to deliver after-hours services as well. And we want to make sure that we've got all bases covered, and if we cannot provide the service that women need, then we will make sure that she is linked into services that can provide those services. We want to make sure that women know that we're there for them, whether they're inside the prison or outside of the prison. One really important part of Djirra has been our Koori Women's Place, which is based in Abbotsford. And we didn't know this when we first established our Koori Women's Place, but it's become a place where when women exit prison, they'll come to us for support. And you know, we've been able to link women into accommodation when they haven't got any accommodation, get some clothes or some food. That is one of the biggest issues that we are seeing is housing. And almost half of our women on remand in Victoria don't have stable housing. And this obviously or clearly impacts on their release and also with getting their kids back. So that is a real concern for us. And yeah, as like our legal team, the bulk of our legal work is intervention orders, child protection and victims of crime. And our lawyers work hard in the prison with the women to make sure all those things are in place for when they're exiting. Intervention orders are in place. We've got our case management team onto housing and also you know, getting everything in place so that we can get their kids back for when they get out. And I guess for us, we don't want to see more money or any money going into making these systems culturally safe for our people, child protection systems, out of home care, and prison systems. You know, we don't want to see an investment into making them culturally safe. We don't want to see an investment into prisons or we prefer to see more of an investment into community to address mental health issues and drug and alcohol issues rather than putting those services into prisons. I guess the other thing that I would like to say is that, you know, nationally, we've been calling for a dedicated national action plan to address violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children, and also some national leadership on the high removal rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And we want to see a child protection notification referral scheme, which would work in the same way that a custody notification referral works, where when an Aboriginal person is taken into custody, an Aboriginal legal service is notified. But this child protection notification referral would mean that if there is a notification made on an Aboriginal child, mum is referred immediately to a family violence prevention and legal service. And we know that notifications come in very different ways, like from police and neighbours and all of that kind of thing. But if we just trialled one way, I think that we might be able to make a big difference with addressing the high removal rates of our children from their mums, because then mums will get the support that they need rather than the punitive approaches that we see that the child protection system takes.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Antoinette. Mindy, I'm just going to race through because we're kind of close to time. Victoria is experiencing a particularly acute situation at the moment, but what are some of the priorities that advocates are calling for in other jurisdictions?
Look, I guess that there's similar challenges across Australia in terms of an ongoing appetite for incarceration. So we're seeing proposed expansions in a lot of jurisdictions, and in some places like Queensland and the Northern Territory, some real regression in terms of things like youth justice policy. And obviously the situation in Victoria at the moment with the bail legislation and increasing numbers is pretty dire. We've got, you know, new builds looking to happen in New South Wales and Tasmania. But I do think that there are some real differences in terms of the extent to which governments are actually responsive to starting to rethink these directions and starting to reevaluate the extent to which it might actually be possible to shift gears and to start embracing a more evidence-based approach to justice policy. And I certainly applaud the Minister for Corrections in Victoria for launching this incredibly important report, because the evidence in this space is really clear. There's some jurisdictions, obviously, that are moving in some really important directions. The ACT is leading the way in terms of raising the age of criminal responsibility. South Australia is quite interesting in terms of centring the importance of housing first type approaches. I guess that there are a lot of examples across Australia of good evidence-based programs, including many of the ones that are represented today, Djirra and Flat Out and so on, that are having amazing outcomes for the people that are sort of coming into them. We can point to these good examples. We've got a long list of them. There's lots that are really well evaluated. There are others that aren't, but are still having, you know, good case studies. We can point to the principles of those programs. The problem at the moment, and I think the challenge politically and systemically, is that it's often just a matter of luck if somebody comes across a program that's really good. For instance, that assists them with post-release support or supports them with court diversion into drug and alcohol treatment, or that allows them to sort of access services. So most women, most people in prison are still not able to access services for a range of reasons, including obviously the criminal justice reasons identified today, but also geography. And I guess there's a huge amount of work to do outside of the justice system to properly invest in supports that allow people to genuinely build a pathway away from prison. As Antoinette and others have said, First Nations and Aboriginal controlled organisations are absolutely critical in terms of building that service structure. We know what works. It really is a matter of trying to bring the community along with the importance of this, and also, I guess, political leadership in this space, and really, looking closely and in a clear-eyed way at what the evidence is, even if the evidence is sort of happening internationally, but also especially if it's happening in your jurisdiction in a small-scale way. We need to really build on the hopeful things that are happening in the community that we know that work.
Thanks so much, Mindy. And Dorothy, I'm leaving the final word to you. You've been on a huge journey over the last few years, but can you tell us about some of the things which have made the most difference to you, and what would have changed your direction if these experiences had come earlier?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Wow, where's another 30 minutes? So what made an integral difference to my life? So what the women before me have talked about has absolutely been my experience. What made all the difference to my life was a project that the Centre for Innovative Justice undertook some years ago now with Jesuit Social Services about women who had an acquired brain injury and contact with the criminal justice system. And it was actually the manager of where I lived who approached me asking if I would want to speak to these, women. And that was the beginning of changing my life, of somebody asking what had happened to me, which had never happened in my life before. No one ever asked me what had happened, what was going on in my life, or what had happened to me. And they really wanted to hear my answers. They really wanted to hear what had happened to me. And that was the beginning of my life changing. And from that point I started to work more. And when I say work more, I mean I started to talk about my experiences, but I didn't share very much at all. And initially I would only use my nickname. I was terrified of retribution from police, and of being found by, men from my past. I would only use my nickname. I never consented to any type of, photos or media. It was horrendous being me, and, living with the fact that I'd been to prison and, I wasn't a part of a community, and I was just so disconnected from life and from everything. And slowly, and then, as you're aware, Elena, I was offered employment with the Centre for Innovative Justice, and the most remarkable thing is that all of the people that I work with have brought incredible healing to my life. I have been enabled and allowed to grow into the person I really am, and to experience healing and change, and to be treated with dignity and respect. And that was the first time in my life that these things had happened, when I first came into contact with CIJ. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. And it's certainly, I think I've got a job to sum up the discussion, but because we're close to time, I think Dorothy's done it for us in terms of those two words, dignity and respect. It's not rocket science, is it? And what would the system look like if it was designed in a person-centred way, as Elisa has said, to see in a strengths-based way, to see women for their resilience and their strengths, and to meet women where they're at, instead of working in a way that's about suiting the system rather than suiting the woman. That's the big, it's not hard to do if we boil it down to seeing people as individuals and as human beings. But for now, I'm just going to throw over to Rob to introduce the Minister, and I'm sorry, Minister, that we're running, so we've had so much to cover.
Thanks, Elena, and don't worry, the IT doesn't shut down at 4 o'clock. We're certainly keen to hear from the Minister. Look, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Natalie Hutchins, the member for Sydenham and Victoria's Minister for Corrections, Crime Prevention, Youth Justice and Victim Support. Natalie has held a whole array of portfolios over her stellar career, and many of which touch on the issues that we've been speaking about today. So she certainly has an in-depth knowledge of the issues that we've been speaking about, and is well positioned to formally launch this substantial paper, which we hope will act as a useful resource for government in the future. I might also say that the Minister has sat through, at her request, the entire panel discussion. She wanted to hear all the voices that we've heard today. I really appreciate that, Natalie, and I'll now ask you to formally launch the paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks to the entire team at RMIT's Centre for Innovative Justice, Elena, and all your researchers who have pulled together an amazing paper. Leaving Custody Behind tells a really important story, and it's the story of women who have contact with the justice systems, their experiences, their trauma, their overrepresentation, but also the effects on the broader community and their families. And I want to recognise the impacts that the current bail laws are having on the incarceration of women, and in particular Aboriginal women. And I say that up front. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which I failed to do at the start, pay my respects. So, but look, this is such important work. Not just in the area for me of being Corrections Minister, but also through the lens of crime prevention. I realised it was about a year ago that I became the Minister in these portfolios, and it was in the first 24 hours that I realised if I could be the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Education and the Minister for Employment and Family Violence Prevention and Mental Health and everything else, that we'd have a real shot at the root causes of crime. And that's what it comes down to. And that's what crime prevention needs to focus on. So other than, you know, thinking about being a megalomaniac and taking on all of those portfolios, I was realistic and thought, how is it as a minister in this government, can I better connect with the other ministers to ensure that we have a holistic approach? And I say that because whilst we have some issues with our bail laws and the high levels of remand that are disproportionately affecting women, we also have some real issues around the causes of crime, which you've all touched on. And can I thank our amazing panel for their absolute wonderful insights and honesty. Mindy, I found what you said around public perceptions probably hit the nail on the head, disappointingly. But I have found for all the bad toughness that COVID has brought to us and the lockdown, I have found a new compassion in our local community for the most vulnerable in our community, for those that are homeless, for those that are suffering at the hands of family violence. And I guess as a government, we need to make sure that we're getting that message out, that these things are connected when it comes to women becoming incarcerated and women committing crimes. And, you know, it's not all women, but the reality, as you've all said, it's a majority of the women have root causes of crime that really go back to trauma experiences and experiences of themselves being taken away from family or a whole raft of other things. And then, of course, that is compounded by the fact that it is women that are the caregivers in our community. It is women who are the mums. It's the women who predominantly look after our elders or the disabled. And it's when women come into contact with the justice system that devastating ripple effect that goes across the community. And I think that is spelt out really well in this paper. We are, as a government, doing what we can to work on improving the welfare of women who find themselves in custody, but I know we can do better in stepping up and trying to avoid women coming into contact with the custodial setting. So as a female minister, as a feminist, I find this work is probably some of the most important work that I can do in my day-to-day job, and I recognise that the system needs to change. We are in the processes of trying to step that up with our investments. We have had a $20 million investment into a women's diversion and rehabilitation strategy. Unfortunately, many of those programs weren't stood up in as better timely manner as they could have been, primarily because of COVID shutdown and not being able to access some of those programs quickly into the prison system, but they are very much rolling out now. And I think the important thing with the Leaving Custody Behind paper is it's a stark reminder that trauma-informed responses are absolutely needed to guide how things go in our correction system, and they've got to be the absolute foundation of our justice system. I did mention the overrepresentation of Aboriginal women, and Antoinette hit the nail on the head with everything that she said, and that is the system is built by white male privilege. It's now time for that criminal justice system to change and for some of our laws to change. And we've been working through that as a government with the Aboriginal Justice Agreement that's in phase 4 now, and identifying the opportunities for reform to reduce Aboriginal overrepresentation. That has led us to be able to make a commitment in the most recent budget of $33 million in preventing Aboriginal deaths in custody. And the 3 key elements in that go to the heart of supporting women in custody and Aboriginal women in custody is firstly the establishment of an Aboriginal Women's Healing Centre at DPFC. Now I know that that doesn't do a lot for stopping women from getting into prison, but what that does is gives a cultural lens for people to rehabilitate and leave prison and not return. And that work's underway, of course, continuing the family violence after hours support that we do in partnership with Djirra. And I'm also looking forward to receiving the work that CIJ and Djirra are working on around options for an Aboriginal women's residential program into the future. Yesterday, I had the absolute privilege of being with an organisation called EACH in the eastern suburbs out in Healesville to turn the sod in a big pool of mud with a whole lot of people who are receiving alcohol and drug rehabilitation programs there at that site, which is about to build another 20 beds there. And to hear particularly from 2 of the women who are going through the program now, just how on edge how close to losing their own lives they were, coming into contact with the justice system, being suicidal, drug and alcohol abuse, years of trauma, and both women that spoke had lost custody of their children. They were going through this program in order to turn that around, and they were already seeing the light, and it certainly gave me a reminder about how important these services are, particularly when women are exiting prison, but also to prevent women from going into prison and making sure that they have that support at a timely point in their lives. In terms of a trauma-informed approach, which the paper certainly touches on a lot, we know that the needs and profiles of women entering the justice system are complex and interconnected and can cause further harm and trauma in their time in prison if not dealt with seriously. So it's really important, and I've emphasised this in the work that Corrections Victoria does, in being able to systematically review every local operating procedure using a trauma-informed impact assessment. And we're looking at each procedure with women's needs and experiences at front of mind, and everything from those daily conversations with women and staff through to the design principles in terms of our facilities. I'm happy to clarify that the SWAN Unit 1 and 2 at management units at TPFC will be taken offline once the DPFC upgrades are complete, and we will be demolishing those units. I was pretty taken aback visiting that site in my first week as Minister about a year ago now, just to see what terrible facilities they were. So in my recent announcement around stepping up more prison beds, certainly that was in line with being able to take a lot of those prison beds offline. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make those announcements simultaneously because we were still using some of those facilities for COVID isolation. So just to finally touch on one really important point, Elisa, that you raised, and that is the link between housing and security. And I'd much rather be investing in housing than in prison beds, and recognising the lack of opportunity in housing is a really important thing for this government. When you're not worried about where you're going to sleep or where you're going to get your services or your next meal from, when you're not worried about those things, you can start to get your life back on track. But unfortunately, when you're in that situation, those things take precedent. So I'm working really closely with Minister Wynne on the 10-year plan for affordable housing strategy, and also making sure that we're getting part of the investments out of that into the social and affordable settings that we know are required by those justice clients, and including women that are leaving prison. I've also been able to announce recently $4.6 million to see new self-contained units being built at Annie North Haven sites in Greater Bendigo, and providing specialist accommodation for women to transition into long-term housing and back into the community. We also stood up, as part of a new program last year, a partnership with Women's Housing Limited to commence the transition of women leaving Dame Phyllis Frost into supported accommodation, particularly women who have served very short sentences, 3 months or less, or who are on remand. And I'm happy to say that since October last year, we've been able to assist 183 women. It's obviously not the whole cohort, but it's a really good start moving forward. And one of the best things I think I've seen in visiting our two women's facilities has been the family engagement workers and the new therapy that's being put in place to reconnect women with their families and their children, and with better legal services along the way in regards to access to their kids. So there's an overview. It doesn't present all the solutions. I'm really excited about this paper because it gives us some really good foundations in going forward. And I want to thank everyone who's worked on it, and to officially launch the paper, and to say thanks to all of the researchers involved, and to everyone who's online today for being a part of this reform. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Natalie, for your very encouraging words, and for, can I say, demonstrating a real willingness to engage in relation to these important challenges. The CIJ certainly wants to work with government to support reform in this area. We do know that there's a lot of interest in these issues, so we'll be distributing information about how to follow up with questions and information relevant to the paper. For now, however, I want to thank our fantastic panel. I want to thank you, Minister Hutchins, and the CIJ team for not only putting the paper together, but also for bringing this event together. It's always a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I want to thank in particular Heidi Phillips for the work that she's done. Thanks everybody for joining us. We look forward to continuing this important conversation across Victoria and beyond over the longer term. And I leave you with this particular point. We will not, at the CIJ, we will not give up on trying to make the justice system a positive intervention in people's lives. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.